They say the cruelest slap isn't the one that lands on your cheek, it's the one that lands on your soul. And that day, when my daughter's hand struck me across the face, in front of her husband and her 2 children, it wasn't my skin that burned. It was 30 years of love, loyalty, and fatherhood turning quietly to ash. The sound of it was sharp, like glass cracking in a silent room. No one moved. Her husband froze halfway through a sip of wine, her son's fork clattered against the plate, and her little girl hid behind the dining chair, too young to understand that she'd just witnessed something that would haunt her grandfather forever. My daughter, my Lydia, stood there trembling, her eyes bright with anger, her voice quivering with words she would never be able to take back. "Stop embarrassing me, Dad," she spat. "This is my house now. You don't get to tell me how to live in it." For a second, I couldn't breathe. The room was large, filled with light, expensive furniture, and the smell of roasted chicken, but all I could feel was the cold. The kind that seeps into your bones when you realize you've just become a stranger to your own blood. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I didn't even look at her husband, who sat there pretending not to exist. I just straightened my collar, picked up my walking stick, and said quietly, "You've built yourself a beautiful home, Lydia. I only pray you've built it on something stronger than pride." Then I turned and walked out, each step echoing through the hall like a nail being driven into a coffin, the coffin of everything I once believed a family should be. When the door closed behind me, I knew something inside me had closed too. But not out of weakness. Out of clarity. You see, some storms don't start with thunder, they start with silence. And sometimes, silence is just revenge waiting for its moment to breathe. Before I tell you what happened next, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because sometimes, the stories we share remind us that silence isn't weakness, it's power learning how to speak. My name is Edward Hale, 66 years old. I live alone now in a modest seaside house on the edge of Capon, where the wind smells of salt and old wood. The waves beat against the rocks like a tired heart that still refuses to stop. Most mornings, I sit by the same window with black coffee and watch the gulls circle the gray horizon. You might think a man like me enjoys the quiet, but truthfully, silence only feels peaceful when it's earned. Mine wasn't. Mine was forced. For 40 years, I worked as a civil engineer building bridges, schools, homes for other families. Every project had my signature hidden in the blueprints, a small EH tucked into the corner, my private promise to build something that would last. When my wife, Margaret, passed 10 years ago, I turned her dream into my final design, a 2-story villa for our daughter, Lydia. White brick, slate roof, wrapped in sunlight from every angle. I told her it was my gift for her new beginning. Back then, Lydia was everything a father could hope for: brilliant, graceful, and full of fire. She married Caleb, a real estate investor who wore confidence like cologne. I didn't mind his charm. Every man learns that time reveals the difference between polish and substance. At the wedding, he told me, "Sir, you've raised an incredible woman." I smiled and replied, "She's not raised, son. She's inherited." The house cost me nearly $5 million to build, every inch measured, every beam chosen by hand. It wasn't just a house. It was Margaret's memory turned into stone. Her sketches still hung in my workshop. When I handed Lydia the keys, she cried, "Dad, this is too much." "Nothing is too much for the blood that carries your mother's name," I said. For the first year, she called every Sunday. We'd talk about the kids, the garden, the stubborn hinges on the back door. But as the seasons passed, the calls stopped. My visits grew shorter, more formal. Her tone changed, small corrections in her voice, tiny hints that my presence was less welcome each time. Once, when I arrived unannounced to fix the mailbox, she stood at the gate with folded arms. "Dad, you really should call first," she said, smiling thinly. "Caleb's been saying the neighbors talk." "Talk about what?" "That you still come and go like it's your house." That was the first crack I heard, not in the walls of her home, but in something deeper. Pride has a way of sounding polite before it turns cruel. Still, I convinced myself it was just stress, or gossip, or life moving too fast. I planted new roses by her porch and told myself love would bloom where gratitude failed. But even roses stop growing when the soil goes cold. I used to think you could build a family the same way you build a bridge, calculate the weight, strengthen the supports, make it unbreakable. I was wrong. Because bridges collapse when the person on the other side stops believing in crossing. Now, when I think of that house, I no longer see walls and windows. I see warning signs I ignored, the polite distance, the forced smiles, the conversations that ended one word too soon. I see the slow erosion of respect, brick by brick. I should have known then that love without humility is just architecture without a foundation. The change didn't come like a storm. It came like a slow leak, quiet, almost invisible, until one morning you realize everything around you has grown damp. At first, it was small things. Lydia stopped calling me Dad and began calling me Edward whenever her husband was around. "Edward, can you pass the salt?" she'd say at dinner, her voice light, casual. Caleb would grin, oblivious, but I could feel something hollow behind her tone. A boundary, newly built, freshly painted. I told myself it didn't matter. Names were just words. But a father knows when he's being renamed by distance. The first true wound came one Sunday afternoon. I had driven 2 hours to drop off a carved wooden chair I made, the same pattern her mother loved. I found Lydia on the patio hosting a garden brunch for neighbors. A few women glanced up when I walked in, whispering the way rich people whisper, softly, but sharp enough to cut. "Dad," Lydia said, half smiling, half frowning. "You should have told me you were coming." "I thought you'd want to see what I built," I said, setting the chair down. "Your mother designed this pattern." One of the women, a tall, thin, polished, sipped her champagne and said, "It's so nice that you still make things by hand, Mr. Hale. Not many people your age stay so traditional." The others laughed softly. Lydia joined them. That laughter, polite and poisoned, was the sound of something inside me breaking. That evening, Caleb pulled me aside. "Sir, you don't need to do these things," he said gently. "The neighbors might misunderstand." "Misunderstand what?" I asked. "That you're still trying to manage Lydia's life. She's independent now." Independent. The word landed like an accusation. I had raised her to be strong, not ungrateful. I began to notice how my visits became appointments. Her messages grew shorter, colder. When I came to check the gutters after a storm, she stood on the steps and said, "We have people for that now." The workers she hired stood behind her, waiting, pretending not to see the old man holding a ladder he no longer had a right to climb. The worst came from the children. Her little boy, Ethan, used to run into my arms shouting "Grandpa." Now, one day, he said, "Mommy says you always break things." I looked at Lydia. She said nothing. Just turned away, pretending to scroll through her phone. That night, back at my seaside home, I sat at my desk and opened my old leather journal, the one Margaret had given me on our 25th anniversary. The first page still bore her handwriting. A home is not measured by its walls, but by the respect that echoes inside. I wrote beneath it, "Ours has gone silent." Weeks turned into months, and I became a ghost in their lives. Still, I'd stop by sometimes, fix a hinge, oil a lock, trim the hedges, as if tending to a memory rather than a home. Lydia would watch from the window, never stepping out. One afternoon, a neighbor, Mrs. Connors, stopped by my car as I was leaving. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but people talk here. They say you still keep keys to your daughter's house. That it embarrasses her." I smiled faintly. If people spent less time talking about houses, maybe they'd have more time to build their own. But her words stayed with me the entire drive home. That evening, I tried calling Lydia. She didn't answer. Hours later, a message appeared. "Dad, please stop coming by unannounced. Caleb feels uncomfortable. The neighbors notice everything. I'm not that little girl anymore." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I wrote back only one line. "You may not be that little girl anymore, but I'm still the man who built your world." She didn't reply. The next time I saw her was at a family dinner, my birthday. She barely looked at me. Caleb toasted to Edward Hale, the man who taught us the value of hard work. Lydia smiled, but her eyes were elsewhere. When I blew out the candles, I wished not for more years, but for one honest conversation. It never came. As the months passed, her home began appearing in glossy magazines, the Hale Villa of Beverly Bay, a modern masterpiece. They praised its design, its elegance. No one mentioned the man who had laid every brick. I clipped one of those articles and pinned it above my desk. Not out of pride, but as a reminder of how easily creation can be stolen by entitlement. By the time winter came, even the grandchildren stopped visiting. The calls ceased. The silence grew heavy. And yet, I didn't hate her. Not yet. I told myself she was just lost, blinded by comfort, distracted by status. But somewhere deep inside, I feared the truth, that pride had already taken my daughter farther away than distance ever could. And pride, I've learned, doesn't fall with noise. It collapses in whispers, the kind you hear only when the house you built stops calling your name. It happened on a Sunday in early spring, the kind of day when the air smells of new beginnings, though that one would mark my ending as a father. Lydia had invited me to lunch. It was rare, and I thought perhaps she wanted to mend things. I even wore my best gray suit, the one Margaret bought me years ago, and carried a bottle of Bordeaux from our old collection. When I arrived, the house was full, her husband's business partners, their wives, a table of polished strangers with perfect smiles. "Dad, you're early," Lydia said when she opened the door. Her voice was polite, but her eyes flicked toward the guests, calculating how my presence might fit their image. "I didn't want to be late," I replied softly. "It's been too long." The dining room gleamed, sunlight on marble, crystal glasses catching light. The children sat quietly, trained in perfection. I took a seat at the end of the table, opposite Lydia and Caleb. For a while, everything was civil. Laughter, small talk, the usual performance of happiness. Then one of Caleb's friends, a sharp young man with slick hair, raised his glass and said, "You know, Lydia, this house is extraordinary. It's amazing how quickly you two built such a life." She smiled proudly. "We've worked hard for it." The room filled with applause. I said nothing at first, but something in me stirred, the memory of blueprints, late nights, Margaret's hands guiding my pencil as we designed this very home. Finally, I said quietly, "Every beautiful house begins with good roots. And this one was planted long before any of you arrived." A few guests looked at each other. Lydia froze. Her smile hardened. "Dad, please," she said under her breath. "I'm only saying," I continued gently, "your mother would be proud to see her dream standing this tall." A silence fell, awkward, stretched thin. Then Caleb laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Mr. Hale's being modest. He's the reason this place exists." But Lydia's eyes were knives now. "No, Caleb," she said, "we're the reason. We paid for every renovation, every design update. It's our home." I nodded slowly. "And I'm glad. I only hope you've built it with the same respect you inherited it with." Her voice dropped to a whisper, tight with anger. "You always find a way to make things about you, don't you? You couldn't just let us have our moment." I looked at her, my daughter, standing there with my late wife's eyes but a stranger's pride. "You call it a moment. I call it a foundation." She stood up, trembling, her face flushed red. "Enough, Dad." Caleb reached out. "Lydia, please." But before he could finish, she turned toward me. The room blurred. Her hand rose, fast, sharp, and the sound cracked through the air. The glass on the table trembled. For a second, no one moved. Even the children froze. My cheek stung, but the real pain wasn't there, it was in the look on her face, not of shock, but relief. As if striking me had proven something she'd been dying to prove. Caleb whispered, "Lydia," but she didn't hear him. "This is my house," she said through her teeth, her voice shaking. "You can't come here and humiliate me in front of my guests." Humiliate her? I had built the ground she stood on. I had carved her name into the very beams of this house, but in that moment, she wasn't my daughter. She was a stranger defending her throne from a ghost. I straightened my back, looked around the room, faces lowered, whispers dying in their throats. I didn't speak for several seconds. Then I adjusted my cufflinks, my voice calm. You've built yourself a fine empire, Lydia. I only pray you've built it on more than pride. She opened her mouth to reply, but I didn't wait. I turned toward the door. Ethan, my grandson, stood in the hallway clutching his toy car, tears in his eyes. I knelt, brushed his hair back, and whispered, "Never raise your hand to love, son. It leaves a mark you can't wash away." Then I left. Outside, the air was cold. My reflection shimmered faintly in the window, an old man with a bright red mark across his face, but eyes that had gone still. As I walked to my car, I didn't feel shame or rage. Only clarity. Because in that slap, I heard something louder than anger, the sound of a bond breaking clean in two. And I knew, with the calm certainty of a man who spent his life measuring structures, that once a foundation cracks like that, it never stands the same again. That night, the sea outside my window was restless. Black waves colliding with the shore like a heartbeat too heavy to steady. I sat at my desk, the same one where Margaret once helped me draft the first sketches of Lydia's house. The lamp's yellow glow fell on my trembling hands, still faintly bruised where I'd caught myself after the slap. I didn't feel anger. Just an unfamiliar stillness, the kind that comes after a storm, when the world seems to hold its breath. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, though it barely warmed me. On the far wall hung a framed photograph, Margaret and I, standing beside a foundation trench, both covered in dust and smiling like fools. The day we began building Lydia's home. Beneath the photo, in Margaret's handwriting, were the words, "Build with love, but protect it with wisdom." I whispered into the quiet, "I tried, Maggie. I really tried." For a moment, I imagined her voice beside me, soft, certain, the way it always was when life tested me. If ever our child forgets where she came from, she'd said once, remind her, not with anger, but with truth. I reached into the drawer and pulled out a thick brown envelope. Inside were documents, the Hale family trust agreement, drafted years ago. Lydia's house was listed clearly, held in the Edward and Margaret Hale family trust, revocable, controlled by the founding trustee. My name. Still there, still powerful. I traced the letters slowly, my breath steady. I had promised Margaret that the trust would keep Lydia safe, that no one could take what we built together. I had never imagined the danger would come from our own blood. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the one name I hadn't called in years, James Whitaker, my attorney and old friend. He answered on the second ring, voice groggy with sleep. "Edward? It's been ages. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, James," I said quietly. "I just need to review the family trust documents." "At this hour?" he asked, concerned. "Yes. At this hour." There was a pause long enough for him to sense something behind my tone. "All right," he said finally. "Come by my office in the morning. I'll pull the files." "Thank you." When I ended the call, I leaned back and closed my eyes. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows. But inside me, everything was calm, the kind of calm that comes when pain turns into precision. I took my pen and opened my journal. On a fresh page, I wrote. April 3rd, tonight, I learned that love without respect is a structure without steel. It may stand tall, but the first storm will bring it down. Tomorrow, I will rebuild, not with walls, but with truth. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking each second like a countdown. I poured another drink but barely touched it. The bitterness on my tongue wasn't from whiskey, it was from realization. For years, I had mistaken silence for peace. I had believed that letting her have her way was love. But love without boundaries is permission for disrespect. And I had given her that permission one too many times. The slap wasn't the beginning of our fall, it was the echo of every moment I'd chosen to stay quiet when I should have spoken. I stood and walked to the window. The sea was silver under the moonlight, endless, merciless, honest. Somewhere beyond those waves was the reflection of every decision I'd made. And tomorrow, I would make one more, one that would restore the balance Margaret always spoke of. As I turned off the lamp, the room plunged into darkness. Only the faint beam from the lighthouse outside cut across my face. I whispered one last time before sleep found me. You struck me, Lydia. But you'll learn soon enough, silence has a longer reach than anger ever will. And with that, I made peace with what I had to do. Because justice, when carried by the quiet, never misses its mark. Long before that slap, before the silence and pride, there was laughter echoing through sawdust and sunlight. The first time I ever held Lydia as a baby, Margaret whispered to me, "Build her a life strong enough to shelter her heart." That became my purpose. Not fame, not money, her. We didn't have much in those days. My hands were rough from labor, Margaret's from painting. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment over a bakery in Cambridge. Every morning the scent of fresh bread filled our small kitchen, and Margaret would hum while she sketched on the back of receipts door frames, window arches, rooftops lined with ivy. When we build our first house, she'd say, "It'll have a window facing east." I want her to grow up seeing the sunrise. Lydia was 5 when I built that first window. We couldn't afford hired help, so every nail, every hinge, was set by hand. I'd balance her on my shoulders so she could paint the first layer on the new walls. She'd giggle, and Margaret would pretend to scold, "Edward, she's dripping everywhere." But we both knew we were building more than walls, we were building belonging. I remember the night Margaret came down with the flu, the same night a storm broke our roof. I stayed awake patching leaks with plastic sheets, Lydia sleeping against her mother's lap, both of them shivering. When the roof finally stopped leaking, Margaret smiled weakly. "You'll keep her safe even when I can't, won't you?" I said, "Always." I thought I meant from the world. I didn't realize she'd one day need to be protected from herself. Years passed. Lydia grew, faster than I could keep up. When she turned 16, I built her a study desk from leftover cedar. She ran her fingers over the polished wood and said, "Dad, one day, I'll have a house just like yours." I told her, "You'll have better. You'll have one I design only for you." She smiled, hugged me, and whispered, "You're my hero." I didn't know those words would one day hurt more than any slap could. Margaret didn't live long enough to see that promise fulfilled. Cancer came quietly and took her the way night swallows light. The day we buried her, Lydia stood by my side, her small hand gripping mine. "She said you'd finish her dream," she whispered. So I did. It took 5 years. I poured everything into that house, savings, time, and what was left of my soul. I designed it from Margaret's old sketches, white walls, long glass corridors, a balcony facing the sea. I called it the Hale Residence, but Margaret's initials were hidden in the blueprint, carved into the main beam above the entrance. When the house was finished, Lydia had just finished college. She brought Caleb home for the first time, young, sharp, ambitious. He admired the structure like a collector, not like a man who saw its soul. Still, he said all the right things. "This house is a masterpiece, Mr. Hale." I told him, "It's not a masterpiece. It's a promise." A few weeks later, I gathered them in the study. "I want you both to have it," I told them. Margaret would have wanted her daughter to live where her dreams began. Lydia burst into tears. "Dad, we can't accept this." "You're not accepting it," I said softly. "You're inheriting it." But I wasn't foolish. I knew how quickly gratitude fades when luxury grows. So I placed the house in a revocable family trust. The title would bear Lydia's name for the world to see, but I would remain the controlling trustee. A safety net, Margaret's invisible hand over her daughter's future. When I signed those papers, my lawyer, James, asked, "You sure about this, Edward? Control can feel like mistrust." I said, "It's not control, James. It's protection. Love needs boundaries or it becomes weakness." And for years, everything seemed fine. Lydia called the house Mom's dream come alive. She hosted family dinners, filled it with laughter, sent me photos of the garden blooming. Each time she smiled from that balcony, I thought Margaret could finally rest. But life changes slowly, then all at once. Caleb's success brought money, and money brought pride. Lydia began remodeling, tearing down the warm cedar paneling I'd installed, replacing it with marble and glass. I said nothing. But when I visited one afternoon and found Margaret's painting, the one that once hung above the fireplace, had gone, I finally asked, "Where's your mother's portrait?" "Oh, Dad," she said with a laugh, "it didn't match the new design." That was the first time I saw it, the faint shadow of entitlement behind her smile. Over the years, I'd given her everything: knowledge, comfort, safety. But I'd forgotten Margaret's warning: if you take away every storm from your child, she'll never learn how to stand in the rain. And so, in trying to shield her, I had raised a woman who thought sunlight was her birthright. That night after the slap, I reread the trust papers again and again. Every clause, every line. The power was still mine. The house was still mine. Margaret's legacy, my design, our years of love, still under my hand. It struck me then that maybe the only way to protect her from pride was to take back what pride had stolen: humility. I turned the page of my journal and wrote, "A house endures only when those who live in it remember the hands that built it. Tomorrow, I will remind her." And that became my final promise, not to Margaret, not to Lydia, but to the truth itself. The following morning, I was waiting outside James Whittaker's office before the sun had fully risen. Boston was still quiet, the streets slick from last night's rain, the city waking with the same heaviness I carried in my chest. James arrived holding a cup of coffee and froze when he saw me. "Edward," he said, eyebrows lifted. "You look like a man who didn't sleep." "I didn't," I replied. "Let's begin." Inside his oak-paneled office, I placed the Hale family trust file on his desk. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through the pages. "You've kept it perfectly intact," he murmured. "So, what do you want to do?" I leaned forward. "I want the house sold. Immediately. Discreetly." He looked up sharply. "Does Lydia know?" "She doesn't need to," I said. "The trust allows me full authority to transfer or sell assets without notice to beneficiaries." James exhaled slowly. "You're sure about this?" "Once the sale goes through, it's irreversible." I stared at the document's title, the Edward and Margaret Hale Family Trust, and thought of Margaret's handwriting on that old photograph: "Build with love, protect with wisdom." "I'm sure," I said quietly. "It's time the foundation remembered its builder." James nodded, though regret flickered in his eyes. "I can arrange an estate appraisal. There's a private firm, Horizon Estates, they buy family properties outright. No loans, no delays." "How long?" 3 days. 3 days. That was all it would take to erase her arrogance and restore her mother's name. "Do it," I said. That afternoon, I drove to Lydia's house under the guise of retrieving some old tools from the attic. The gate still bore the brass plaque that read "The Hale Residence." The words used to make me proud. Now, they looked foreign, like they belonged to strangers. The maid let me in. The house smelled different, sterile, expensive, devoid of warmth. I climbed the stairs, slow and steady, until I reached the attic. Sunlight filtered through the small window, illuminating dust floating like ghosts. There, tucked in the corner, was a metal box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were old photographs, Margaret's sketches, and copies of the trust papers. I slipped the documents into my coat and stared at a photo of young Lydia holding a toy hammer beside me, grinning. "Dad," she had said then, "when I grow up, I'll build houses too." My throat tightened. "You did, Lydia," I whispered. "You built one on pride. Now I'll rebuild it on truth." The sound of car tires on the driveway startled me. I peeked through the window. Lydia's SUV pulled in. She wasn't supposed to be home. I quietly placed the box back and started toward the stairs, but her voice cut through the silence. "Dad?" I froze. She appeared at the top of the stairs, confusion giving way to irritation. "What are you doing here again? I told you to call first." "I came for a few of your mother's things," I said. "They belong with her memories." She folded her arms. "You can't just walk in whenever you please. Caleb and I have a life. You can't keep treating this house like it's yours." I met her gaze, calm and even. "This house still stands because of me, Lydia. And yes, it is still mine." She laughed sharply. Yours? You gave it to me. I placed it in a trust, I said. A trust that bears your mother's name. Not yours. She shook her head. You're unbelievable. You just can't let go of control, can you? This is why I stopped calling, Dad. You always want to remind everyone that without you, nothing exists. I wanted to tell her that control wasn't the issue, that gratitude was. But I had already said enough. Some lessons are learned only when the walls start closing in. I'll be gone soon, I said. Enjoy your afternoon. That night, I sat with James again to finalize the sale. The buyer, Horizon Estates, wanted to inspect the property for valuation. We'll tell Lydia it's an appraisal for insurance purposes, James said. The next day, a tall man named Matthew Davis from Horizon Estates arrived at the house. Lydia, though skeptical, agreed to let him in after I explained. I walked through the rooms with Davis, watching him jot notes while Lydia followed, impatient. What exactly is this for? She asked. Routine paperwork, I said. Estate policy review. She shrugged and walked away. Davis leaned closer and whispered, It's a remarkable house, Mr. Hale. Solid craftsmanship. You built it yourself? Every line and nail, I replied. Then you'll be pleased to know Horizon is ready to make a full cash offer. Closing within 72 hours. I nodded slowly. Proceed. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the sea roaring outside, the house smelling faintly of salt and old wood. James emailed the final contract. I printed it, signed it, and stared at my signature for a long moment. It didn't tremble. When the pen lifted from the paper, I felt an odd lightness, as though the air itself had exhaled with me. 3 days later, the transfer was complete. The funds were wired to the trust's account. The Hale residence, valued at $5 million, now belonged to Horizon Estates. At 6:17 that evening, my phone rang. Lydia. Dad, her voice cracked through the line, something's wrong. I got an email from the Homeowners Association, something about a new owner? What's going on? I took a breath. What do you think is going on? Tell me you didn't, Dad, you can't do this. This is our home. No, I said quietly. It was your mother's. You just lived in it. Until you forgot who built its walls. She went silent. Then came the tremor in her voice, half anger, half disbelief. You sold it? You actually sold my house? I looked out at the lighthouse blinking over the black water. I sold my wife's dream. The dream you turned into a trophy. There was a soft sob on the other end. You've destroyed me. No, Lydia, I said. You destroyed yourself the moment you struck me. I only removed the walls that let you hide from what you've become. I ended the call. That night, I poured another drink and sat by the window. The ocean was calm now, the wind steady, no longer howling. The kind of peace that only follows justice done without rage. James called later to confirm. It's official, Edward. Sale closed. Wire complete. Horizon's taking possession next week. Good, I said. And the proceeds? Still under your authority. What will you do with them? I smiled faintly. I'll find a way to make Margaret's dream live again. Somewhere it's earned. When I hung up, I wrote my final note for the night. May 7th, the house no longer bears our name, but for the first time in years, I can breathe. I built it with love, she defiled it with pride. Today, love took it back. The following morning, the newspaper ran a small headline. Horizon Estates acquires the Hale residence, confidential sale completed in record time. No photographs. No interviews. Just one quiet sentence marking the end of everything I had built and the beginning of something cleaner, truer. Outside, the sea glimmered silver in the dawnlight. I raised my coffee cup to the horizon and whispered. For you, Margaret. For the peace we never lost, only reclaimed. And in that moment, the air inside my small seaside home finally felt light again. When justice is silent, it echoes the loudest. The morning after the sale was finalized, the world outside felt unusually still. The ocean behind my house was calm, its waves folding neatly against the shore like someone smoothing the wrinkles of an old sheet. For the first time in years, I felt no tension in my chest, only an emptiness that wasn't sorrow, but release. Lydia didn't call again that day. But by the second morning, my phone began to tremble on the table, over and over. Missed calls. Voicemails. Texts. Each message more desperate than the last. Dad, please, let's talk. You've gone too far. Caleb is furious. The kids are confused. They think you're punishing them. She didn't understand. This wasn't punishment. It was correction, the kind life gives you when love refuses to lie anymore. By the third day, Caleb himself called. His voice was sharp, defensive, arrogant as ever. You've made a huge mistake, Edward. That property was legally ours. You'll face consequences for this. I let him rant until he ran out of breath. Then I said calmly, the only consequence I face, Caleb, is peace. And that, I can afford. He hung up. By the end of the week, moving trucks lined the driveway of the Hale residence. Neighbors stood at their gates, whispering, watching the fall of a family they'd once envied. Lydia stood there, arms folded, sunglasses covering the eyes she inherited from her mother. She didn't fight the movers. She didn't shout. She just stared as they carried her furniture out of a house she once called her world. James handled the logistics. The funds from the sale, every cent of that $5 million, sat quietly in the Hale family trust account, untouched. You're the sole authority now, he reminded me. You can dissolve the trust or reinvest it. I'll reinvest it, I said. But not for her. That same evening, I took out a blank notebook and began sketching again. For the first time since Margaret's death, I drew not for others, but for purpose. The lines flowed easily, guided by something steadier than ambition, clarity. The plan was simple, the Margaret Hale Foundation for single mothers and homebuilders. I wanted women with children, like Lydia once was, to have what Margaret never did: is security without pride, strength without arrogance. James smiled when I told him. That's a beautiful idea, Edward. It's not an idea, I said. It's an apology to the version of my daughter that still lives somewhere inside her. Days turned to weeks. The newspapers moved on. Horizon Estates demolished the house, my house, to make room for a new luxury villa project. I drove by once, just to see. The structure was gone, leveled, nothing left but dust. Yet watching it fall didn't hurt me. It liberated me. Because I realized something: bricks don't keep memories alive. Respect does. And respect had already died long before the walls came down. About a month later, I received a letter. The handwriting stopped me cold before I even opened it. Lydia's. Dad. I hated you when I saw the locks changed. I hated you even more when the movers came. But now I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. Caleb is gone. He left last week, took what was left of our savings. I thought I had everything, but I had nothing. The kids ask about you every night. Ethan says he misses building toy houses with you. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I'd like to visit, just once. Your daughter, Lydia. I sat in silence for a long time. The room seemed smaller, the sea quieter. I didn't feel triumph, only a soft ache, like the echo of something that once hurt deeply but had finally begun to heal. I didn't write back immediately. I waited 3 days, then sent a short reply. The door here was never locked, Lydia. But remember, this time, you walk through it with humility, not heels. A week later, she arrived. Alone. No car, no husband, no perfume of wealth. Just a woman stripped of illusions, carrying 2 bags and a face that had aged from grief, not years. We sat by the sea in silence for a long time. Then she said, "You didn't destroy me, Dad. You saved me." I just didn't see it. I looked at her and said the only thing that mattered. I didn't want to save you, Lydia. I wanted to rebuild you. She nodded, eyes wet, and for the first time in years, she didn't look like the woman who slapped me. She looked like the little girl who once painted the first walls of her mother's house. Before she left, she asked, "Where will you go now?" "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I've got a new project." "The foundation?" "Yes," I smiled. "Your mother's dream, finally done right." She touched my hand lightly. "Can I help?" "Not yet," I said. "But one day, when you've built something you're proud of, not for show, but from soul, you'll know where to find me." As she walked away, I felt something loosen in my chest, resentment, perhaps. Or the illusion that revenge ends when justice is served. It doesn't. True revenge ends when peace replaces the anger it cost you. That night, I stood outside, the salt air sharp and clean. The stars reflected on the black water, flickering like embers from a fire long extinguished. I spoke softly into the night, not to Lydia, but to Margaret. "I did what you would have done, love. I built with love, but I protected with wisdom. And though our home is gone, our legacy stands taller than ever." The next morning, I opened the Hale Foundation's doors. The first applicant was a young widow with 2 children, holding a folder of sketches. She said shyly, "I heard you help mothers build their own homes." I smiled. "That's exactly what we do here." As she left, I ran my hand over her sketches, simple, sincere, imperfect. But there was heart in them, the kind that Margaret used to draw with. I looked out at the rising sun and thought, the house I lost gave birth to 100 more. And in that moment, I knew revenge had fulfilled its purpose, not to destroy, but to rebuild what pride had broken. It's been 2 years since I last saw the Hale residence. Where it once stood tall, cold, and proud, now rises a new complex, faceless and glittering, built for strangers with money but no memory. I pass by it sometimes, not out of regret, but remembrance. Because that house wasn't my greatest creation. My greatest creation was what losing it taught me. I used to believe revenge was destruction, an act of taking something back through pain. But I learned that true revenge isn't about burning bridges, it's about reclaiming the ground beneath them. It's not the fire that heals, it's the rebuilding that follows. When Lydia left that day by the shore, she turned once, as if to say something. She didn't. She didn't have to. I saw it in her eyes, the humility that pride had buried for years. And that, more than anything, was my justice. Not the sale, not the money, not the silence, but the awakening. Now, my days are quieter. I wake with the sunrise and walk along the coast where Margaret and I once dreamed our daughter's future into being. The sea still speaks if you listen long enough. It tells me that what's broken can still be made beautiful again, just never the same. The Margaret Hale Foundation thrives now. We've built 12 homes so far, each one designed not with marble or ego, but with resilience. Every brick carries a story of someone who learned, like Lydia, that losing everything isn't the end, it's the invitation to begin again. Sometimes I sit with the women we help. They ask about my life, my family, my daughter. I smile and tell them only this. A house is just a body. Respect is its soul. And when the soul dies, even the strongest walls collapse. They nod, quietly understanding. I no longer carry bitterness. I carry lessons and blueprints for better hearts. If you've listened this far, if you felt even a spark of truth in this story, then you already understand what I've learned. Silence isn't weakness. It's power waiting for purpose. So, if stories like this remind you that respect, humility, and justice still matter, then subscribe to this channel and stay with me. Because some truths are too heavy for revenge alone, they need to be told, shared, and remembered.